Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Nicholas Dirks, who is a former chancellor of UC Berkeley and currently is the president and CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences. And in addition to that, you've authored a bunch of books. The most recent book is this one called City of Intellect, The Uses and Abuses of the University, which of course follows on a number of books on Indian history and anthropology. Welcome, Nick.
Great to be here, Greg.
Now, I remember reading, I guess it was maybe 30 years ago or so, Clark Kerr's book. And I was actually inspired by that book, even though I think it was probably a couple of decades old when I read it. But, you know, he was, I think, in many ways, the best articulator of a certain vision of what the university could do in the modern era. And I think to some extent you channeled Clark Kerr a little bit in trying to figure out how the university can navigate the 21st century. And you've had a bunch of ideas. You spent most of your life straddling the divide between the research side and the administrative side. And I think one of the lessons that you learned is one that Clark Kerr also learned, which is that no matter how radical faculty are, they're incredibly conservative when it comes to the institution of the university. And I think the main question that you raise in this book is the university has inherited a lot of the prestige and commitments of the religious institutions which predated them. And in England in particular, right, with the collapse of the monasteries, the nationalization of the monasteries, the university took over that role as the place where the intellect could potentially thrive. And a lot of people are wondering whether or not we're confronting a new transition where the university is losing its relevance and that people are finding it more difficult to have the level of commitment to thought and the pursuit of truth that they've had over the last couple centuries. And I guess your book is somewhat optimistic, and you think that the attacks that the university are facing at the moment are ones that will be overcome. So how have you come to this realization, first of all, that the university is sort of the inheritor of these older institutions, and how have you come to the conclusion that the university is not quite in as much danger as it might appear?
So thanks, Greg, and you packed a lot into that opening question. So I'll try to, first of all, back up a little bit and provide some context about, how I come to all of this. At the same time that I address, what I think is a really critical question now for those of us who care about the role and function of the university, who think that it's an important institution, and who worry about its future trajectories and prospects. So I sort of went to college when I was, a teenager and never left. I had an opportunity to go to a college up the road. I grew up in a suburb of New Haven, Connecticut, and I went to Wesleyan up the street, which was just in some ways the closest place I knew about it, and a place where one of my teachers in high school had gone, and he recommended I do that. And it turned out to be a great choice because it was a very interdisciplinary kind of college. And in fact, I did my major in a college of social studies that was really modeled on the Oxford PPE program and was hardwired as an interdisciplinary kind of space. And I actually focused on a new area of inquiry that they had opened up just a couple of years before I started that applied that interdisciplinary approach to the study of Asia and Africa. I'd gone to India when I was a kid, and I was fascinated by my time there, and I wanted to do a little bit more study of it. And then, of course, I went on, as you know, but for those listening, I went on to graduate school to study South Asian history. I went to the University of Chicago. It turned out my historian professor advisor was an anthropologist by training, so I had to continue perforce to be interdisciplinary in my outlook. Otherwise, it was hard to kind of, really understand where my advisor was coming from. And I ended up taking more courses in anthropology than I did in history as a graduate student. And then got a job, and thank God I got a job because it was the late 70s. It was a bad time for academic employment, in fact. People think that today is bad. It's been bad before, and it was not particularly great in those days. But I got a job at Caltech, which I understand you spent some time in. And I taught distribution courses in the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences. And nobody was majoring in history, leave alone any of the other multiple set of disciplines that were part of that division. But that meant I could teach, from any different kind of disciplinary angle I wanted to do so. And it was great to be there. But then at some point, when I got an offer to go to Michigan, to the university in Ann Arbor, I took it because they actually allowed graduate students and majors in the fields that I had focused on, in particular history and anthropology. But even at Michigan, which was interdisciplinary, I started thinking about how to create more interdisciplinary kinds of contexts and the like for students, for graduate students, to have the same kind of advantages I'd had both as a college and a student and a graduate student. And I created, along with one colleague of mine, a classical historian, Sally Humphreys, an interdepartmental PhD program in anthropology and history. And it was great because it really did open up opportunities for students from all kinds of different backgrounds to get a different kind of graduate education. But I suppose it was great in one sense. In another sense, it kind of changed my career because it was an administrative success, as it were, on the basis of which I then was recruited to Columbia to be the chair of the anthropology department there. It was the first department of anthropology in the US. It was created by Franz Boas, a legendary anthropologist who went on to train the major anthropologists in the early 20th century, then went on to set up departments of anthropology across the US, including at places like Northwestern, UC Berkeley, and others. I wasn't even a PhD in anthropology, but I was able to perform the part, and again had some success in doing that, and then was recruited to be a dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. That was 30 departments and 35 different institutes, centers, and programs, and then came to Berkeley as chancellor. So, in a way, my kind of you could call it my interdisciplinary interest. You could say my dilettantism, whatever you want to. Label it as, did kind of stay with me my entire academic career. And I became interested in that sense in the totality of the university. How is it made up? Why is it that we have the disciplines that we do? And more to the point, and to your question, why is it that, for the most part, the departments and disciplines that were established in the late 19th, early 20th century continued almost unchanged to be the dominant structures that organize the university even in the early 21st century. So it was from that background that I first read Clark Kerr's book, The Uses of the University. It was based on his Godkin lectures that he gave at Harvard in the early 1960s when he was still the president of the University of California. And he did actually reflect later to say that he probably thought it would have been a better idea for him to not give those lectures and not write that book when he was still the sitting president, because he said a few things in the book that got both faculty and students upset. He talked about the knowledge industry, and so he fell afoul of student radicals in the free speech movement in 1964 who said, what do you mean industry? I mean, if this is an industry, then you're just trying to corporatize us and think about us as cogs in a machine. And Mario Savio made a famous speech about wanting to break the machine and not be a cog in it. But he also upset faculty because he tried to change things, and he wrote about the stubbornness of faculty. And as you put it, the more radical the member of faculty, in terms of their political positions, the more conservative they were in terms of their institutional positions. And I found it really interesting when I first read it. But then I became convinced that Kerr really had been a kind of visionary. He'd been involved in setting up new universities as part of the UC system, Santa Cruz, San Diego, and others. And Santa Cruz I knew something about because my father, having taught at Yale, moved to Santa Cruz, where he was a dean of humanities. And it was set up without departments. But like many institutions that were set up as part of a kind of utopian impulse to do things differently, it reverted to the mean, and little by little, it began to become increasingly like Berkeley and like UCLA and like the other campuses in the UC system. And I became fascinated why it was that this kind of institution full of people very smart, very committed to the life of the mind, supposed to be out there, finding out new knowledge and discovering, where the frontiers of knowledge really exist, are themselves so reluctant to really think about change. And Kerr had said in his book that things do change sort of willy-nilly. I mean, it's the university doesn't exist outside of history. It isn't completely inured to the changes of the world beyond the ivory tower. But on the other hand, he worried that it would change too slowly to accommodate itself to the changing conditions around it. So when I was a dean at Columbia, my primary job was to strengthen each department, and so I hired faculty and worked with chairs of departments, and I wanted each department to get higher ranked and be better regarded. But of course, I also had that enduring sense that maybe it would be better if we stop thinking just about the ranking systems and focus more on different ways to connect faculty and students, not just across cognate or adjacent departments in the way that I had done when I was in Michigan, but across the entire campus, from the side of the arts to the side of the sciences. But there were limits to what I could do in a position of being dean, and so I did some things that tried to advance the prospects of various interdisciplinary programs. But I also had to be aware that the bread and butter of the dean's office was about serving the departments as they existed. But coming to Berkeley was a huge opportunity. It was very exciting to move to the greatest public university in America. But I did so at a time of significant financial distress. And it was during those years that I began to think maybe there are ways in which one can combine thinking differently about how you organize the university with efforts to try to reduce some of the underlying costs of higher education. And of course, the hallmark of the University of California had been that it was really very inexpensive for students to come here. And little by little, tuition was ratcheted up, fees went up, and the cost of housing, of course, with the rest of housing in California went up. And I began to see the kinds of issues that had to be confronted across the university, which were in part, I think, intellectual challenges. How do you actually fashion, for example, the humanities at a time when artificial intelligence and new forms of technology are taking off and really changing the entire landscape of careers, of jobs, of work, of how people communicate with each other, how people make decisions about what they buy, who they see, who they date, who they marry, and how does that then square with the kinds of traditional preoccupations of the disciplines. And although I was at the same time, of course, in a way caught up just in the drama around trying to balance a budget, turns out it's a lot harder to change an institution when you're threatening people with losing resources, and that isn't a conducive environment for institutional change. Nevertheless, really did get me, in a way, in a kind of private conversation, as it were, on a regular, ongoing basis with Clark Kerr. So that book and his insights and perspectives became a kind of counterpoint, for my time when I was chancellor. I was the 10th. He was the first chancellor of UC Berkeley. I felt like, there was this kind of, 50-year conversation taking place. And I began to think more broadly about the prospects of the university. And, again, we can drill down on these different points and parts of your question. But I did become convinced that unless we find ways to become more open to change, we're not going to deal either with some of the intellectual challenges we're facing. And I mean by that not just abstract intellectual questions, but also how do you really prepare students for the world into which they're about to go. At the same time, that we really do have to deal with these questions of cost. If we're serious about access, and we talk about access and excellence at UC Berkeley all the time, we have to think about it not just in terms of who gets in, but in terms of who can afford to get in. And even if they're getting financial aid, whether they can really, in fact, manage to get out of a four-year college without massive debt that becomes itself an impediment to actually doing something that would be adventurous, that would help define the future, that would secure for our graduates the license to become leaders and the kinds of people that we want to graduate out of a great public university.
And indeed, the title of your book, right, comes from Clark Kerr, right? City of Intellect. But you recounted at the beginning of the book a story where you were an undergraduate at Wesleyan and you went to a seminar and you heard this debate, and it was a truly memorable experience for you. And I think you got the notion that, hey, this is the way things are going to be, right? Not only for the rest of your career, but you also, I think, got the sense that this is what undergraduate education is all about. And I think that for a lot of undergraduates, that's not the experience they get. And I think this is because there are a couple of reasons, some of which are articulated by various critics on both sides. I think the folks on the left would say that the university has become this factory for cranking out people who have professional credentials, and it's not a place for them to learn what it's like to be a human being. And the folks on the right would say, well, it's because this kind of debate has been squelched. But there's a third critique, which is that you've got this institution which is designed to advance knowledge through the pursuit of research, and that's a fundamentally different business than that of educating undergraduates. And what undergraduate education has turned into for some people is it's teaching you how to become a graduate student, teaching you how to be a researcher, and only a very small percentage of these undergraduates are going to wind up becoming researchers. And so those critics have wondered why it is that we have combined the role of undergraduate education and academic research, and that we should maybe be thinking about the multiversities instead of the university.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any merit to that critique? I know when you were at Columbia, there was sort of a fraught relationship between the college and arts and sciences, where the former prioritized undergraduate education and the latter prioritized the graduate programs. Is this a tension that's inevitable? Do we want to have these two? What are the trade-offs with having these two functions reside in the same institution?
Yeah, there's been a tension really since the rise of the research university in the US that itself was modeled on the creation of the research university in Germany in the early and mid 19th century. Between teaching and research, as I say, just since the beginning, and the argument has always been on the part of people like me who have been in university administration that research, in fact, advances teaching, and teaching is something that also is good for researchers to do, both because they learn how to communicate better, but because they also learn from students and have ideas that otherwise they wouldn't have if they didn't have that kind of intense engagement with younger people who are learning some of the stuff for the first time and asking questions that sometimes may seem naive, but often become the questions that really drive further exploration and discovery. But the answer sometimes feels a little bit too pat, because there are tensions, and those tensions, are sometimes solely that somebody who may be a great researcher is a lousy teacher, or vice versa, which is sometimes the case. But it also is more fundamental in the sense that to really be a great researcher, to write the number of papers in economics that you have to write if you're going to get tenure and then become an established figure in the field, to do the kind of hard research and everything from applied physics to even computational biology. These are non-trivial research areas, and you really can't easily combine them with a total commitment to teaching. And I think there have been a number of critics from both sides. There are some who think the United States took a wrong turn in the late 19th century, that we should have established research institutes. I mean, in the end, although Germany created research universities, they also created research institutes like the Max Planck Institute.
Right? Max Planck. They have no
Yeah.
undergraduates there.
No undergraduate teaching, so they're just doing research, and they're very, very good environments for people to do the kind of advanced research we need today. And by the same token, there are those who believe that teaching colleges really should be teaching colleges, and that faculty, maybe they are given opportunities to do some research, but they should not think of themselves primarily as researchers, because otherwise they're going to sell the students short and not really provide the kind of undergraduate experience they need. Now, my own experience, and you alluded to it, and I write about it at the beginning of my book, was a kind of, I don't know, it seemed to work so well that, it kind of fueled my own utopian idea that you could bridge these divides and overcome these tensions, because I had professors at Wesleyan who were, at the top of their fields in terms of their publication and research, but we're deeply, deeply committed to teaching undergraduates, and doing so in these kinds of cross-disciplinary environments that created that really memorable course in my freshman year, where two very, very different kinds of people debated free will and necessity and took very different positions, but ended up being quite amiable and agreeable about disagreement, which I thought was a great way to model what a liberal arts education should be all about. But the truth is that there are these tensions. Columbia, where I was for a long time, and as you also said, is a place where there's been sometimes almost perpetual warfare going on between the college and the graduate school, and a sense that there really were competing priorities that were zero sum in terms of if you did this, you couldn't do that, and so on and so forth. Andrew Delbanco, one of my colleagues at Columbia, a wonderful professor of English, who himself has written, terrific books on everything from Abraham Lincoln to Herman Melville, nevertheless also written a book called College, and published it at Princeton University Press, in which he argues that the ideal of undergraduate education in the U.S., even at smaller liberal arts colleges, is fundamentally flawed because of the fact that everybody who's teaching in those colleges got a PhD and at some level sees themselves as either a great researcher or a frustrated researcher, and still, evaluates their time and their fundamental priorities in relationship to their graduate experience. And they don't ever really, get into the mindset of primarily being instructors of young minds who need total commitment in order for that educational experience to really provide what we promise. And he's got a point. Other critics have made those arguments. Myself, I came to believe that, in fact, the biggest impediment was not so much time and not so much commitment, because I know a lot of people who are both able to juggle the time commitments and the kind of moral commitments almost in terms of research and teaching. But I think the biggest impediment becomes in some ways the fact that when you're in a graduate school and you're teaching graduate students, you're really thinking about reproducing yourself. That is to say, training students to become like you. And to that extent, graduate school is a process of reproduction. But then what happens often is that when you're in that environment, that's how you think about your discipline. And so when you create a curriculum for an undergraduate, you basically, write a watered down version of what the graduate curriculum is for an undergraduate who may not need, in fact, may not want, and probably is deeply frustrated by a curriculum that is sort of designed for them to go on to graduate school. And the number of students, very, very good students, who go on to graduate school in those fields that they major in is going down both because there are fewer jobs in the academy, but also because the academy is not necessarily as attractive a place as it used to be. I mean, there's so many exciting things that once students get into these colleges and have the opportunities they afford, there's so many opportunities they'll have after they graduate. So again, to go back to my example about artificial intelligence and humanities, you wonder both for the students and for the purposes of the university, or the idea of the uses of the university, to go back to Clark Kerr, might be better served by thinking about creating an undergraduate liberal arts curriculum that really is designed less for the one student going on for graduate school, more for the 20 other students in that class who might go on and work in tech or finance or startups of one kind or another. But who it would be, I think, fair to say, might benefit when they're designing an AI program from a deep understanding of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. What does it mean to talk about balancing freedom and harm? These are fundamental questions now in AI. They're fundamental questions that go into writing algorithms, and they're questions that have been part of the history of social and political theory that are, again, sort of bread and butter for a liberal arts curriculum, but aren't usually taught in computer science. So, how then do we take the problem of research and teaching as you set it up, but stand it on its head perhaps, and find different ways to design a curriculum that can take things out of research, but genuinely insert them into an undergraduate appropriate kind of plan for teaching and learning that that will really bring the best of the university into the world outside when our graduates go out there.
Well, I teach organizational design, and I've been interested in the organizational design of the university for as long as I've been studying at universities. And there are these profound differences between the way universities are run and the way most organizations are run. And you allude to them in the book and how difficult it is to do, say, a reorg, right? When we look at for-profit enterprises, they're doing reorgs all the time, right? They're shuffling things around and saying, okay, well, we're no longer going to have a country division, we're going to have a product division, and it's painful and there's a lot of resistance, but at the end of the day, the CEO typically will prevail and push this thing down. You can't do that at a university. And with faculty governance, there's a lot of frictions to doing anything. And I guess the question is that a feature or is that a bug? I mean, should we think about having universities perhaps be a little bit more like other organizations? Is that a risk worth running? Or is that something that would fundamentally compromise the integrity of the university and the success of its mission?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question because if you talk to most faculty, they will say, what you're proposing, or at least asking about, is a fundamental challenge to the whole principle of academic freedom, which is that faculty control the curriculum. They're the ones who design what you teach, how you teach, why you teach. And it's just for the administration to figure out how to bring students in and serve the students' purposes and support the faculty and support the research that they want to do, but which they want to do, and not that is mandated by anybody in an administrative position. And sometimes you can influence it by, creating resources that encourage people to do certain kinds of things. But you can't really, aside from moving the cat food, do much to change or direct traffic in relationship to either teaching or research. But and to be honest, there are good reasons for faculty to have that kind of skepticism, because when universities like Stanford, for example, were established in the late 19th century, the board of trustees and the president, who served the board of trustees, made all the decisions about everything, including curriculum. And in fact, it was an event that took place at Stanford in, I think it was 1908, when Mrs. Stanford implored the president, David Jordan, to fire a faculty member because he displeased the Stanfords, and did so, only to have a tenth of the faculty at Stanford resign in protest. And one of them, Arthur Lovejoy, who then went on to teach across his career at Johns Hopkins, create, with a number of other colleagues, including John Dewey from Columbia, the American Association of University Professors in 1915. And it was that association that, was part of the professionalization of the American professoriate. It was also about the institutionalization of ideas around academic freedom, which were to protect the faculty from the dictates of trustees and administrators. So, if you look back, there are good reasons for that. And today, academic freedom is under assault in various kinds of respects. And there are examples, and we've seen them all in the last few months, of members of boards of trustees who want to tell presidents and faculty what to say and how to conduct their business. And that generates a good deal of pushback, to say the least.
Well, look, I understand why faculty would want to resist control from the outside, whether it be from political figures, and you described that in your book, and from donors, let's say, or even from employers or journalists. But from their own position, I mean, if you're a team of athletes and you're trying to win games, then you're going to delegate to the coach quite a bit of authority, because you know that it's in the collective best interest of the team to delegate to someone the capacity to make the difficult decisions, right? And it seems like faculty are unwilling to do that, to give to someone that they could potentially trust the authority to make decisions that impact everybody, but benefit the general community. I mean, you talk about budget cuts and how the default way to do budget cuts at UC is just spread it like peanut butter, right?
Right.
And
right.
there's no attempt to figure out where is the biggest ROI, right? Where will the cuts do the most harm to the best interest of the university as a whole? So why do you suppose that is? That is it because there's just a lack of trust? You talk about there's this trust barrier between the faculty and the administrators.
Look, there's a huge trust barrier, and it was one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to try to, first of all, tell a story where I saw anyway that my move from being a member of faculty to being a member of the administration was a kind of seamless move. I wasn't, I didn't go to the dark side. At least I wasn't intending to go to the dark side. I did learn some things along the way, and I learned about budgets, and I learned that, the notion that we're entitled as members of faculty to endless resources, and that all the money is being spent in nefarious ways by the administration. It turns out it's a little more complicated than that. Many faculty don't even understand how endowments work, that it's restricted money. It can't be used for general purposes, and it's very specifically tied by legal agreement, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I wanted to suggest that not only was it counterproductive to have that level of distrust, but that in fact it was becoming urgent to find different ways to really change the way we think about the administration, because not only does the administration know a thing or two, and you can argue about it, but nevertheless you also have to concede that there's perspective of the whole, which is valuable and which most members of faculty don't have, but also that they understand that sometimes not only the need for change, but some of the directions in which change should go. And in any event, if we don't start finding better ways to work together, we're going to just let the ship go into an iceberg, which is just sort of waiting for us. And that's where I'm not quite as optimistic as you suggest, in the sense that I certainly am concerned that without some serious change, universities are going to run into greater and greater difficulty in the years ahead. and that we shouldn't see the current loss of trust not just between faculty and administration, but between the public and the university. And that includes not just university administrators, but also university faculty, especially tenured and tenure track faculty, as a blip on the screen. It's actually become systemic. It's getting worse and worse and worse. It's, I think, going to produce further levels of both regulation and just downright skepticism about the value of the university system in the U.S. I think it's a gold standard. I travel around the world and I hear educators and political people and members of the public and people in corporations around the world tell me that, you know, the pride and joy of American society is its university system. But you talk to Americans today, and they don't necessarily agree with that. So what is it that we need to do to try to preserve the great things that we have achieved, but also acknowledge that in the context of preserving it, we may have to do some fundamental things to change things. And that's when, your question about, who's going to direct that change? How is that change really going to take place? Are we going to be serious enough about the change that we accept and begin to undergo comes in, because, that's where corporate America has found better ways to proceed. Now, it's not that, when you have established institutions in the corporate world that they always manage to survive. I mean, what are the longest lasting institutions in the world? Well, they tend to be either religious institutions or educational institutions. And better than me, the kinds of trajectory, ups and downs of companies. And it tends to be the new ones that are coming up that are the most innovative. And if the old technology company like IBM doesn't, begin to adjust, Watson is its last big swan song before it fades away. And of course, IBM is right now trying to readjust and building the biggest quantum computer in the world and doing other things that are hopefully going to, by virtue of its fairly major commitments to change, going to, retake its position. But all of this is to say that, there are things to learn in the university from the world outside. How we can, develop a better understanding of how those changes might take place, and then, agree to work together to effect them, however, is a huge, huge challenge. Stanford has been, I think, much more open to these kinds of changes, and it's been a good thing for Stanford. It's prospered in the last years because of that. Berkeley is a great university, and it has, a lot of wonderful reasons to be proud of not only its history, but of its current position in the ecosystem. But it's a place that really used to change a lot more than it wishes to do right now. And I think, there are things that Berkeley can even learn from Stanford. Not to say that Stanford is a perfect university by any means. And if I look at the university system as a whole, I actually look at some of the third tier universities that have changed, that have become, in some ways, models of what other universities might be doing. Among them, for example, Arizona State University, when Michael Crow left Columbia, and we were there together in 2002 to become the president of ASU. People in New York said, "Why are you going there? I've never heard of ASU." It's a regional third tier university. For the last 9 years, it's been ranked the #1 innovative university in the U.S. And so there were things that he's done that are now being recognized. And, to some extent, the changes there were because it wasn't a place where the faculty could sit back and say, we've always done this. It's always worked for us. We've always been great. We'll always be great.
Does it surprise? I mean, setting aside a few exceptions, does it surprise you how little turnover there has been among the top tier universities? And does it surprise you how few new institutions have come along, given the frictions associated with responding to change that we see in the incumbent universities?
Yeah, it's a great question because I've asked, and I ask in the book even, why it is that we're going through a kind of, or we had been going before the pandemic, and going through a kind of gilded age. And the last gilded age, you had the John D. Rockefellers and the Leland Stanfords and the Johns Hopkins and any number of very wealthy individuals who decided to create new universities. And
Yeah, where's
you
the
would have thought,
where's the Jeff Bezos University,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Where's the Jeff Bezos University? Where's the Elon Musk University? Dare I ask? And and there are people obviously who made a lot of money in the tech world who talk about the need to disrupt education, but those arguments haven't actually translated into new institutions that are leading the way in terms of the production and dissemination of knowledge, which is what places like Hopkins and Stanford and the University of Chicago did. And they were not only in short order, great universities, but they influenced the way other universities changed. They actually began to put pressure on the Ivy League that had been very hidebound. For example, the Ivy League didn't do engineering, until very recently. It did almost none. There were a few small colleges of engineering at Columbia and I think at Brown, but it wasn't something they did. And now Harvard has a big push to expand their engineering, and at Columbia, the Institute for Data Science that has been spawned by the College of Applied Science and Engineering is one of the most innovative parts of the university. So, there can be that kind of interaction, and there hasn't been. And there hasn't been a lot of change. And if you look at the rankings, it's been pretty constant. There's been one major shift that's taken place over the last 20, 30 years, and that's where what used to be a much greater mix between public and private institutions has become now almost entirely a top 20 made up of private institutions. So you've seen a decline in terms of our research rankings for great public universities. That to me is a source of alarm, that kind of change, even as I would love to see some new names appear in the mix of the top ranked universities.
Well, you spend time at both public and private universities. You're at Michigan and Berkeley and also at Columbia and Caltech. And in the book, you talk about the potential threat to public universities because of the reduction in funding. And you say that this is a major problem. But why is it a major problem? I mean, do we need public funding still in this era? There seems to be so much private money available. And when we look at the endowments of these private institutions, I mean, they're huge. Could we not simply expect these universities like Berkeley and Michigan and Virginia to transition seamlessly into a phase where they rely much more on private funding? Is there any reason to think that private institutions can't provide the same kind of combination of excellence and access that we've been doing at a place like Berkeley for so long?
Yeah, I think I think it's to your point. I mean, it's certainly been the case that private universities have become much more open, much more committed to having a diverse student body, much more aggressive about the ways in which they've been recruiting students from different kinds of backgrounds, both racial and ethnic, and also socioeconomic. But just questions of scale continue to be relevant in that kind of comparison. If, for example, you take Berkeley and UCLA, those two institutions together have more Pell Grant students, which is a way of identifying low-income students, than the top 15 Ivy Plus colleges and universities across America. And the top 15 are the Ivy League plus, Chicago, Hopkins, Stanford, and a few others, WashU, and so on. So, just two public universities pack more punch in terms of recruiting a socioeconomically diverse student body
But why is that? I mean,
than the top privates.
Harvard has so much money, they could presumably create their own master plan, right? Like
Well, they
Clark
could, but
Kerr's.
they don't. They won't. You see, because the problem is that uh, they think about the selectivity index as one of the most constitutive features of their own brand, right? So
But
it's hard to
Berkeley,
get in. It's a
we have
scarce
UC
resource.
Berkeley and we have UC Merced and UC Santa Cruz. I mean, they could have a Harvard and another Harvard, which everyone knew was not as elite and not as exclusive as the original Harvard. I mean, the other UCs are not as prestigious as the original, right? UC Berkeley,
Well,
or at least
yes and no. I mean, I'll just say, just to, I know this may sound disloyal, but UCLA is now often ranked above UC Berkeley in terms of, different kinds of things. And UC San Diego is doing very, very well in terms of ranking. So it's beginning to change in the sense that Berkeley is no longer, the flagship in far removed from all of its other sister campuses. So that is beginning to happen. But why can't you have a franchise for Harvard or Stanford? It's not as if their boards haven't discussed it. I happen to know, for example, a few years ago that Stanford talked about a major expansion and having another campus. But ultimately, it doesn't fit their business model, and they don't do it. And Harvard has been challenged repeatedly to expand and increase the numbers of students. I mean, Berkeley every year adds 2,000 or 3,000 more undergraduates, which is half the number of undergraduates at Columbia, for example. 2,000 is half the number. When I remember at Columbia College, we increased the student population from 4,000 to 4,200. Major hue and cry. We're changing the nature of Columbia College. And, again, as I say, even when I was chancellor in half a decade, we increased the undergraduate student population by around 7,000 or 8,000. So the issue of scale is still important, and I think that is not the only thing by any means, but it does reflect the more general point, which is that public universities do afford more access for more students from more diverse kinds of backgrounds, and they become a lot more expensive than they used to be. But tuition at Berkeley right now is 14,000, 15,000. Tuition right now at Columbia is over $50,000, $55,000, $60,000.
And that's
so
just a sticker
price.
That's just a sticker price too. So
sure, no, it's not what students
don't pay that. Yeah,
a lot don't pay it, but still, the business model for the privates is that you can have a discount rate of 50, which means effectively half of your students are not paying full freight. But you turn that upside down, and the other half are, and that's a lot of money. That's a lot of tuition dollars. So, so the question I'd ask in a kind of broader sense is, why don't we have the creation of more universities at the top level that can we're seeing people are talking about an enrollment cliff for second and third tier universities, and the problem of trying to enroll sufficient numbers of students in both some smaller colleges, particularly in rural areas, and some both public and private universities that aren't top ranked, is becoming more and more urgent. But it's not changing the selectivity index at a place like Stanford. That as you recall, a few years ago on April Fool's, there was an article that came out saying that Stanford had finally achieved what it was working for all these years, a 0% admission, and didn't admit anyone in the next class. And a few people read that and forgot that the date suggested it might be a joke, but it was only partly a joke.
Right. Well, you said that there were a few people that you met who wanted to become academic administrators at the beginning of their careers, but it's a very small number. Most people who wind up as academic administrators sort of do so inadvertently. And I think you became one inadvertently. But what that means also is that people who are at the senior leadership levels of most universities aren't professional managers, right? And so as somebody who teaches in a business school, right, we
Yeah.
like to think that there's some expertise associated with running large organizations. And yet universities, much like hospitals and architectural firms and law firms, are run by people who are not expert managers, but who are practitioners. It, do you think that because you had to spend so much time understanding balance sheets and income statements and managing people, did you find that particularly challenging? Is there any case that could be made for a professional managerial class playing some of that role? Is there any reason to think we should track people early on in their careers into administrative positions?
So, university administrations are made up, of course, of provosts and presidents. Who many presidents were provosts, and most provosts were deans, and most deans were chairs, and all chairs were really members of faculties. And usually there is that kind of apprenticeship period where you first see smaller spreadsheets and then bigger and bigger ones until you begin to take on board a $3 billion budget. And the presumption, and certainly I think in my case the reality was that you learn this stuff along the way, and you learn it not from going to business school, but you learn it by going through these different stages in the administrative hierarchy. But I do think that administrators should be open to perhaps executive education kinds of programs, but nevertheless programs where you interact with people and wise people in the corporate world, both who have had experience and have spent time studying different kinds of institutions. And that would be a great benefit to acquiring the kind of competence you need to do these jobs. And sometimes, you do see people in these positions who really can't read a budget and don't think very much in terms that are really sophisticated enough to fully trust that they know what they're doing when they're making certain kinds of decisions that obviously have major budgetary implications. In my case, I'll give one example, which is that I had a classmate at Wesleyan who went into the corporate world. He went into consulting, worked for a number of different consulting firms, and ultimately ended up at Deloitte. And with another colleague out in the Bay Area, set up something at Deloitte called Center for the Edge. Mm. And initially
John
I thought,
Hagel.
"Wow, this is some kind
of John Hagel."
Yes, that's John Hagel. He went to Wesleyan. He was my classmate. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I reconnected with John. We actually ran into each other at Aspen, and I sat down and we talked about his center and the work he was doing with JSB, with John Seeley Brown. Went out for dinner and so on. And it turned out actually that the kinds of things they were talking about at that think tank were very relevant to institutional leadership in the world of higher education. You can't change an entire institution, and you can't do it even in the corporate world, right? It's a little more, particularly for a long-established institution. But you can begin to change things on the edge, and as you do so, you can model, how things actually might be better, and then people begin to say, "Oh, maybe I'd like to be more like that unit. It looks more interesting. It looks more exciting. It looks like there's things they can do which I'm not able to in this traditional structure." So I thought, that was a good example of learning more from an adjacent world that, is very different in terms of how it thinks about itself. And it was fun to reconnect with a college. We shared a suite together when we were sophomores. I'll never forget when we were together when the lottery took place for the draft. And we all got our numbers. And poor John Hagel was born on a day that got #1 and put him into a depression that turns out he was able to get out of, but and have a very, very fine career. But it was it was fun to reconnect with him after many years, and I felt I learned a lot from those kinds of conversations, which could perhaps be better structured for administrators to get more exposure to early enough that it can really help them think through how to engage in things like institutional change. The difficulty you have when you bring somebody in from outside of a university to have a senior administrative position is that there's just so much about the university that is only really possible to learn if you've been in it. And for the most part in the corporate world, when somebody is running a company, they've worked in that kind of either that company or they've worked in that field. I've never been offered a job running Goldman Sachs or Google, but I have been offered a bunch of jobs running universities. Well, I say that because I think the presumption that universities are badly managed and therefore they need to have somebody who really knows about management doesn't fully take on board, what the impediments to managerial success are in a university. And in part, it's about, precisely the things we've been talking about, the kind of resistance to change on the part of the most senior, the most valuable faculty that you have. Certainly as much as it is about the failure of the imagination of the administrator. But again, I think it's really critical to find new ways to think about institutional change in higher education, and I do believe that we risk serious problems in the sector if we don't take on board much more seriously the need to make this kind of collective commitment to to know ourselves and think differently about who we are, how we function, who we're here for, how we contribute to society, how we survive in the long term.
Well, I mean, the production of knowledge requires a balance between specialization and more general knowledge acquisition. How structurally can we facilitate that balance? I mean, you said that the department might not be the best unit of organization for this job. You propose a couple different ideas. One is to make sure that every faculty member has a dual appointment. There are other ideas, such as the creation of committees, right? Chicago has a lot of these committees. Or are we ultimately just going to have to keep adding new departments? I mean, I think when you joined the area studies group in Chicago, that was a relatively new thing. You helped to create this new school of data science, right? So we just sort of create a whole new school or a new department. Is that ultimately the way we're going to do this? Just keep creating new departments and new schools? Or are there ways to promote the cross-pollination of ideas and interchange across existing departments?
Yeah, I think the idea here, and maybe it goes back to the center of the edge, is that if you create new centers of activity, like the now College of Data Science at Berkeley, you show that there's something else going on that is more interesting and people gravitate to it. And I think that's actually happening in this particular case and in the Berkeley situation. But nobody gives up their home department, and you don't see universities getting rid of things as they add other things. It's just never like that. And
you just add a new layer.
There are so many.
Just add a new,
right. There's so many legacy programs, institutes, centers that it's almost impossible to keep track of them. And it turns out the way you do keep track of them is they keep coming back to you for more money, mm-hmm. And they're offended if you ask them to justify their existence 20 years out or 30 years out, because they exist, therefore they I am, therefore I should be, to paraphrase Descartes. So. But this is where I think the real challenge awaits, because you can't just keep. We don't have the resources, and we can't keep ratcheting up the cost, the fee, the tuition levels, and the like, to support, just an infinitely expanding number of programs. So we really do have to think about how you provide an endpoint at the same time that you're creating new things for these things that can be innovative over the course of a set of years and then stop being innovative and just start being part of the problem. But that is, again, to your question, having to do with faculty governance, that's where the limits of faculty governance begin to show themselves, because ultimately faculty are, and this is rational for them to do so, and I'm not criticizing them, but I'm just stating what is something that I knew when I was a member of faculty as I do now, having been in the administration. If there's a program that's serving your purposes, it's good, and it's a place that you go for additional resources, whether it's for your own research or whether it's for a conference you want to do or a seminar you want to run or colleagues you want to invite to campus or whatever it might be. And of course it's good because it helps you do your work. But, it turns out that that faculty don't think about the pot of money from which support for those continuing centers comes from, and how you replenish that pot when you're also trying to do other things and innovate and change and also keep the cost of education affordable.
Well, I think you said that when you interviewed for the job of chancellor, the questions focused primarily on how you're going to deal with the resource situation, but also how you're going to deal with protests and free speech. And you had to deal with this at Columbia, and you had to deal with it quite a bit at Berkeley. But you, when you were a student, you also were experiencing some protests. Has the nature of this changed? Have things gotten to the point where universities have to fundamentally rethink how they interact with speech activities on campus? I mean, as we speak, there are some protests going on campus. But you described this one situation where you and the provost, Claude Steele, were invited to an event and you were unable to speak at all. And it seems like the kind of behavior that's inconsistent with what we expect from a top-tier research university. If it's outsiders who are coming in, I think we all understand that that's something we can't do very much about. But is there something that we can do as faculty and administrators to make sure that our students understand what productive discourse looks like?
It's become, I think, a real challenge for university administrators across the board too. I mean, at Berkeley, but at Harvard, at Columbia, virtually everywhere, to figure out ways to protect a commitment to free speech at the same time that they take on board what seems to be a kind of new modality of thinking about what protest is and what protest is for. When protest is to make a point and to protest something that is either relevant to what's going on campus. I mean, I was part of a protest about military recruitment on campus during the war in Vietnam, or something off campus, which many universities, Berkeley among them, did, for example, around apartheid in South Africa. You use protest to raise a voice that isn't perhaps as well heard as it might be if it's disruptive for a while. Increasingly, what seems to be the case is that protest is in part about shutting down other voices and, in fact, insisting that those other voices would be sources of trauma for oneself, raising, of course, almost the impossibility of the kinds of things that used to go along with free speech, namely freedom of inquiry, freedom of debate, and openness to exchange views that might be diametrically opposed, but nevertheless assumed to be important to be heard in the context of a university where the exchange of views is fundamental to its own identity and purpose. So, in as much as that has become a kind of driving force, then the point of a protest is to simply shut down something. Now, it was very disconcerting when Claude Steele and I were on a stage, invited there by a student organization, and not allowed to speak. But it's also disconcerting when a student group invites a speaker to Zellerbach Hall, only to find Zellerbach effectively invaded by a protest that breaks windows, breaks doors, terrifies the people inside, and does so with no sense at all that there's something inappropriate about shutting somebody else's right to speak down completely in a way that could be construed, and has been by some construed, to be violent, and not just even nonviolent. So it does feel as if we're confronting a different kind of moment, and it has different dimensions, different components. On the one hand, or in one respect, I think, as faculty, we have to actually work much harder to model disagreement in our seminars, our classes, our extracurricular involvement, so that students learn, as I did in my freshman seminar, that people can have fundamental disagreements and they can still respect each other, or at least respect the right of the other to be heard and to speak. But there's another dimension which simply has to do with the nature of protest. I have to confess that I was disconcerted also when I came to Berkeley by the fact that some students got credit for engaging in protest against me. And I always kind of wondered, what was going on there. And I realized, of course, very soon that, this was because Berkeley sees protest as part of its fundamental identity, and students are encouraged to engage in protest. But the same people who give credit for protesting don't necessarily talk about what the rules of protest are. And there are rules, and there are obligations that go along with it. When Mario Savio was successful in persuading the faculty, the administration, and the Board of Regents to allow free speech on campus at Berkeley in 1964, he immediately began to say, with this freedom comes responsibility. And that is what seems now to be so sorely lacking. So I think that this is a real challenge to the fundamental identity of the university when it becomes, under the name perhaps of trauma and injury, the primary purpose of a protest to close down that same level of exchange and exchange of views and the right of others to be heard. How you do this is going to be very difficult. I know that my successor at Berkeley has raised the question of whether, the provisions around time, place, and manner that are fundamental to the right to protest, namely that the university has the right not to determine, who should speak on campus and what kinds of positions should be taken, but when they can do that, where they can do that, and in what manner they can do that. Chancellor Christ has recently said, it's time to potentially reevaluate, the way we do time, place, and manner at Berkeley, because when you have a perpetual protest going on at one of the major entry points to campus, then it becomes potentially threatening for many people who are who may be seen as the objects of that protest, or who may see themselves as the objects of that protest. And in that regard, I think, the provisions of time, place, and manner are flexible and certainly can be reevaluated. And I actually don't think it's a great thing to give credit for protest per se. I think it would be a better thing to give credit for, not to take credit away for protest by any means, but to give credit for, finding generationally appropriate ways to reintroduce a certain kind of toleration for disagreement that we really are going to have to work to rebuild on a university campus. And we need students to be as actively engaged in that as we need faculty to be engaged along with the administration.
Well, last question. You've devoted your life of teaching and research to history and anthropology. And I think those disciplines at their best are about understanding people from different cultures and people from different time periods. Do you think that the decline of the liberal arts at the center of the university project is in any way related to trends around the capacity to engage in productive dialogue, productive discourse?
I worry a lot about this, and I worry that, in a way, I'm carrying on some just outworn ideas about what the liberal arts can be. In the beginning of our conversation, you referenced the fact that I wrote about the religious origins of the liberal arts. In some respects, the humanities were in fact a replacement for moral and religious education, as it was seen as foundational to college education in America in the 19th century, when many colleges and universities were, of course, founded by religious institutions, by churches or what have you. And then, in the years after World War II, and the kind of second stage of secularization occurred, and one went from thinking about a moral education to an education that opened one up to new social movements, and increasingly took on board not just the great books, but also the great struggles in history around civil rights, around the rights of women, around other kinds of struggles to be far more inclusive for groups that had been traditionally excluded from not just college educations, but from all kinds of modes of access to positions of influence and leadership in our society. When those then became accommodated to the liberal arts, I mean, the liberal arts, as I experienced it, was both about reading, reading great books, and about reading Frantz Fanon or Mahatma Gandhi, or any number of other figures who were very much a part of the post-war struggle for recognition on the part of new groups and new movements. But again, things change. One of the things I learned from history and anthropology is how much things do change over time, and so I keep thinking, what today are the appropriate ways for one to both justify and organize a liberal arts curriculum that would inherit some of the things that I think were so important about earlier modes of doing this, but reinvent it too for the modern moment, and to be more appropriate for the world that our students are in and about to enter. And I'm not sure that I have all the answers, and I'm not sure I could, because of my own generational placement in this. But I believe, nevertheless, and this was, of course, too what in part animated the writing of the book, but I believe that we can find something that will, it might not be the same, and I might not have it exactly, but will continue to carry on the tradition of a certain kind of knowledge that doesn't become confined to either disciplinary or professional modes of knowledge, that can enlighten and enable one's disciplinary and professional education in time, but can also address these issues about what it means to be human. What is a good life? What is a society worth participating in, worth working to build? What are the kinds of broader questions we need to ask about meaning, purpose, and value? And I, for one, very much hope that we will find new ways to continue to keep those questions and those fundamental issues really in mind as we construct at least the early part of the higher educational journey that I was through, that I went through, that I appreciate so much, and that I really believe continues to be so important for the world going forward.
Well, Nick, thanks so much for joining me. The book is called City of Intellect, the uses and abuses of the university. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.